having me here today, and it's a pleasure, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing a lot of the work that I've been looking at over almost 20 years, but I think in the past year and a half, a lot of the impacts of both what it means for our everyday life and also some of the social political implications for this are really important. And I think in terms of both our own well-being, especially also as clinicians, we really need to start to think in this more integrated way. So I want to thank Castle Craig for generously sponsoring my talk today. I really appreciate their help and support with this. Okay, so this is who I am. I think the core thing that you need to know is I love what I do, and a lot of it is how can we really improve on helping people heal and really understanding what are those key innovations or those things that transform the capability for the people that we have the responsibility to look after. And I've done about 5 different areas of specialty training, but I think most of them come down to both complex traumatology, and I think as I've evolved in my thinking and the expertise with it, I think one of the key things that we really need to start to think much more about is the impact of the environment. So I'm going to tackle the first parts 1 and 2 today, and just sort of at least mention the second parts a little bit more. But a lot of it is stress really is, this thought of like, what do we have to be stressed about? But how do we really understand that actually our experience of stress and what our relationship to it makes a big difference. And the things what is it that would spur us on and make us take a more proactive kind of leadership role or inspire us to be kind of more proactive thinkers, parts of the community, versus have us kind of switch off and really feel overwhelmed and distressed to the degree we really don't want to think about or do or say or think the things that we need to. So I'm just going to give a quick recap here. Most of us kind of from the clinical psychology side of things, we know what stress is, but it's also, a lot of it is about our emotional reaction, and that we do need some challenge and some ways of working and thinking with this. And I think some of the elements of this, that is, there are really important factors about particularly our state of emotional, the strain or the tension, and also the negative versus positive factors that are there. And a lot of Seligman's work and Seal's work looking specifically at the body, because the parasympathetic and the sympathetic responses, when our body is able to kind of relax and feel settled versus when we're tense and we're really stressed out, all these systems connect up together. And sometimes that if you talk to most people with stress-related illness, or rather than PTSD, post-traumatic stress, because I think sometimes we need to think of it as not a disorder, but actually as an appropriate response to things that go well beyond what we're able to metabolize and make sense of. And how do we kind of not pathologize that, but how do we kind of keep it in perspective in a way? And burnout, a lot of it is a physiological and emotional response that actually it builds up and up and up. It's like a drip, drip, drip effect to the degree where we really can't handle it. Or if we think about the people that we're working with, there's a kind of brittleness and a lack of resiliency, or a lack of kind of flexibility that starts to happen with that. And that is what starts to take effect at a greater and greater degree. So I think, going back to the physical issues, that just like with depression, that it's a lot of the research now say 60, and probably higher levels, I think it's probably more like 80 if you think about depression, has physical responses or relationships to emotional experience. If you think of particularly headaches, muscle pain, IBS, sexual dysfunctional problems, and also linking up, one of the key themes that we really need to understand with alcohol and substance or other types of addictions. Oftentimes the way that one deals with that is very much related to stress and burnout. So the mental effects of chronic stress and burnout, as I said before, the flexibility issues, the inability to switch off. I mean, how many times, if we think about, we've talked with our patients or even with our own experience, when you put your head down to go to bed and you just can't switch off. And I think some of the things is also understanding what are the related or associated factors with that if someone is, that we're treating, like for the alcohol or drug addictions or other types of addictions as well, we need to kind of keep this in mind to ask about that, or also in terms of our own self-care, because particularly with high impact environments, that looking after other people or working in professional environments, it really can take a toll. But when do we need to really understand when that is and how to take appropriate response to that? So I think one of the key things that I want us to be able to do today is I want to leave you with some really key ways to think about improving your own self-care and the other people who are around you, family, friends, clients, other professionals. And I think there's ways that one's own self-care isn't always as good as it needs to be. And I want you to be able, the gift that I want to give you today is how can we really identify ways to improve that and to kind of optimize that in different ways. And I think this is, I want us to be able to explore today together, and there's kind of different ways we can do that. And I'm a big fan of interactive factors, so I think we'll kind of take a vote on it, and to see which way would you rather me kind of have someone up front where you can kind of see where I can ask them some of the questions, or whether you want to do it in kind of smaller groups. But I want us to actually put this to use a bit, which I think would be really helpful, especially post-lunch. So, and I think in some ways, it's really understanding how extraordinary life can be. And I want to kind of rekindle that like an emotional defibrillator. I want to kind of take my joy of life, which I have, a great joie de vivre of things, and to be able to kind of inspire you a bit to kind of find yours a bit more with that as well. And also to kind of really clarify the goals and the things that you want to work towards and you want to achieve, which I think is really important. So I guess part of, I was, over the summer, I've been doing some work with the BBC. Map cleaner, honest to God. I've been trying to figure out how, if anyone knows how to get rid of that, I would pay gold for that. Good. Thank you. But the BBC called me, and I've been doing with Radio BBC Scotland, and they asked me the issue with people stealing from self-checkouts, and they basically said nothing can get done to be able to prevent that. And I said, well, that's not exactly the case. There was some work that Princeton did, and looking at, they optimized, and for those who don't know, Princeton supposedly is one of the most moral environments in the entire United States, potentially the world. That's what they pride themselves on. Whether it's true or not, no worries, I have kids, so I'm used to chaos. I kid you not. And one of the things they were asking is they optimized the conditions where people could cheat, and even in those environments, the cheating was from 40 to 60%. But when they had, for test taking, and when they had them sign an honor code, the cheating went down to 0, across the board and consistently. Because I think one of the key things that we don't really understand, a little bit like the legal framework, my wonderful friend and colleague Michael is here as a partner in a law firm, and if we think of the expertise in the legal frameworks, that one of the things we don't understand, the psychological frameworks and the kind of mindset or covenants with that, they're just as important. It's clearly setting out and really delineating exactly how do we organize these things and kind of get the best out of them. So I think what I want us to think about today is to kind of, what is your version of your honor code, or the things that to really make you the best human being you can, and also how do you get the people that you're working with in whatever capacity to really follow their own version, and also where you can add your expertise to that, so you can kind of refine the lex romana, or the kind of legal code that you're using, so that really improves the clarity of that across the board. Okay, and I guess oftentimes I think one of the things, I've done several different trainings, and one of the things that's difficult is each of them have a different way of organizing and kind of thinking about different factors. And I think from the psychotherapy side, particularly the psychoanalytic side, it's very different than my clinical psychology training, where it's a lot more like sort of running a military environment, where you hit them hard, you hit them fast, and you get things very clear. You get in, you get out. But I think some of it is, how do we take the understanding for what are the kind of short-term issues and the longer-term issues and goals, and how do we start to think about, as opposed to the way that we deal with the financial sector, which is usually short-term and kind of short-sighted, how can we think about a much bigger vision of things where we actually get this right and we make these incremental changes to really improve things? So I think I want each of you to kind of understand your own way of working to deal with self-care. I want you to think about, taking some of the models that I'm talking about and kind of making refinements to the ways that you're thinking and working. And in a lot of ways, it's giving you an experience of deep, compassionate presence and a really meaningful conceptual reworking of key areas in your life. I'll go through that a bit more in depth as we go through. But some of the work that I'm presenting is very brand new, so I guess I want you to think about it, but if I asked you not to take pictures, I would be grateful for that, because a lot of the diagrams and other things, I've spent a long time and I have not yet published them, so I would just out of respect for that, until I get it published, it just would be very helpful. I appreciate that. So I want you to kind of think about a kind of conceptual reworking and also new frameworks from what I'm talking about, because a lot of what I've been thinking about recently is, how do we heal the tools to heal? How do we make those refinements that actually really can make a significant difference? And how can I apply those ways of refining that process to your own individual, unique, and wonderful ways of working and thinking, and getting you to understand and really appreciate and experience that better. Does anyone know what this is? This is Da Vinci's drawing of Imola, which is a small city, and this is the first aerial drawing before there was any aircraft. And what he did is he measured his foot, and he walked and paced the entire small town, and he measured it precisely to be able to get this visual image. So if we think about, because what I'm talking about and what I want us to think about together is there's certain ways that we think about and we look at the world, and I think there's certain ways that if we change and put together some of these smaller bits of things, we can see things at a breathtakingly, amazingly different way that just literally is a paradigmatic shift. And that's what I want us to really start to appreciate, that there's so much there that we don't really see it or understand it. I think there were reports when Columbus's ships came in, because the indigenous Indian population didn't have words or language to describe it, they literally didn't see them there. And it was only when they got to the shore, when the shaman was able to actually put words to it, that they could see them. And if you think about, I mean, it's, but I think all of us have our own versions of this and our own experiences of what we can name and make sense of and what we're unable to. And I think even with stress, that we have styles and relationships both with stress and how we think about things. And I guess the four areas that I want us to come back to, a little bit like a kind of mantra, is health, work, love, and play. So yeah, think about this. Health, work, love, and play. Because if we think about for ourselves and our own well-being, each of these things, your health impacts on all of these, and all of these impact on your health. Think about that for a moment. Because I think this is one of the things that our body really does absorb like an emotional battery. A lot of Rothschild's work and the body keeps the score, Ogden's work, that a lot of these things, that we store these things up and we make sense of these things at an extraordinarily deep and meaningful level, and all of them interrelate. And I think what the other thing is that we need to understand that the individual, the social group, and the environment, all of these things also interrelate. And I think way, way more than we usually tend to think about. So I want to kind of bring together some of the new models that I've been working on. And if we think of the iCDS model, which is integration, compassion, developmentally linked or stepped aspects, and sustainable issues or sustainability. So if we think about like the four fundamental aspects of physics, this is what makes our reality up. This is what makes things work and sort of integrate and makes it so that we experience things or don't experience certain things. And it changes whether we're stressed out or whether we're, I'm sorry, this is a little bit, can we dim the lights just a little bit? I just realized that some of the, at least in the front, I don't know if we can dim those just a little bit so we can see a little bit more. Sorry about that. I'm looking at my screen, which is perfect. So I think if we think about these aspects, a little bit more if it's possible. That's better. Okay, so I think if we think of issues like oxytocin or cortisol, there's hormones and there's different systems that all of these will kind of change the way that we experience our body and our physiology and our emotional responses. And that we need to start to think about how these smaller blocks of things link up to actually get kind of systems dynamics or kind of a double loop learning of things. There's feedbacks that actually, these little small, it's like if we think of incremental changes or other things, each of these will kind of transform and create different types of integrated systems and also double loop or double feedback systems. And I think these are things that when we start to kind of get to grips with this, I did one of my specialty postgraduate trainings in ethics. I looked at disaster ethics. And the amazing thing was each ethical, like if you take virtue ethics or duty ethics or utilitarianism, each of these actually works against each other. And you think about the implications of that. Why is, with most of the political systems designed not to work in a way, there's a certain sense that each of these actually contravenes and undermines the others. But if you actually think of it in a layered way, you can get a system that's truly integrated and actually works really well. But it changes the whole character, just like a lot of the aspects, what I said with the honor system or the honor code. It changes the whole experience of that. And how can we begin to see these aspects fit together? Because I think this is where, and I think there are issues. Each of these kind of core things, they kind of are simple by themselves, but if we think of intent, for example, it's like if we think of working with our patients and having real love and care, that intent changes their experience and also changes some of those experiences of how they understand who they are and how you link together with that. And if we think of like identity, each of these things they're simple in its kind of concept, but they really integrate and they start to work dynamically at these really live and deep levels. And they actually lead to a system which is so much more dynamic and complex, so much more. Even if we think of, I was speaking recently for the Iraqi conference, which is reconstructing and rebuilding Syria, and I was looking at Syria as a case study for actually the first environmental war, and these kind of simpler things, if we think about the identity of a person or a country, or the intent of social political process outside, social functioning, all of these things actually really do link up and change very deeply all of these, the kind of ecosystem and the health of all these different factors. And I think one of the other things which is really interesting is that they start off, both the interventions are a bit simpler, but also the changes that start to take place, where if you start to look at these things in a really structured way, almost like building or architecture, they get much more complicated and they can give rise to much more dynamic aspects. And also, it's a little bit hard to see, but if we think of something that's very basic and kind of gets a little bit more complex, but these are three-dimensional spheres or models. And so if we think about how does someone, like a child, learn about their self-concept and how they are in their own self-identity, we start off with simpler things, like if I look in the mirror, if I see the dot on my forehead developmentally, if I'm young enough, I won't see it. But if I get older, I start to see that's me. And I'm that person in the mirror with the dot on his forehead. But there's nuanced levels to that, with, like Da Vinci, completely change extraordinarily, profoundly, the dimensions of how we start to understand who we are, both in our own self-concept and also socially, and even in the sort of wider world. I've recently been commissioned to write a book on space psychology, and what I've been wrestling with is literally how do we start to make sense of our own relationship to the much wider universe, literally. And I think those are things that, if we really start to get to grips with, how much is out there, it is kind of mind-blowing, but it's really important that we give thoughts and space for that. Okay, so what's our relationship to stress and burnout? And those of you who have done attachment studies, and I know with Peter Fonagy and Mary Target and all my work at UCL that most of my colleagues who I studied with, we sort of have nightmares about these attachment, strange study and other things but I think in some ways it's very helpful if we start to see how these things overlap and kind of can impact. So you're going from, some of these other issues, but actually what happens when you start to layer them up? What happens if you have a partner that has a dysfunctional environment and where your stuff and their stuff map onto each other, and actually this is actually a double layer. So if this is just one's own stuff, if you think of another layer on top of that, and if you add another one there, if you have a child, say, with ADHD or other things, where it starts to get pretty impenetrable. And what are we aware of our attachment patterns, and how do those work? And I think some of it is also, when I was walking here today, I love faces, and human faces for me, they're like the most extraordinary art forms. And it's really extraordinary how, when you look at people's faces, oftentimes how stressed they are. If we think of the difference between a really joyful face versus one that really is tired and worn out and distressed, our emotions, and we really express those quite profoundly sometimes, much more than we realize, and they literally etch into our face. I was speaking for the ENT Plastic Surgery Conference about 5 months ago, and I was co-chairing with Peter Adamson on face transplants. And one of the things we were talking about is that the muscle structure, that if you think about taking the skin flaps and the other things on someone else's face, I'll leave the rejection issues in terms of the other stuff to the side, but even that, the muscle memories in that, like when you take someone's heart and you transplant it into another person, there's people that never liked heavy metal or poetry. They when they start, their spouse asks them, why are you listening to Megadeth? And I have no idea, but yet, somebody else started writing poetry that had never picked up a pen and just had any kind of factor to that before. But there are these things that get encoded in our bodies that are really, really incredible level. And I think there's things that our experience affects us, and also our relationship and how we metabolize that and what we feel about that. And to really start to be mindful of that. And I love this picture. I think, have we been taught to have higher stress and burnout than others? Especially in and around addictions, most people that have grown up in whatever addictive environments, it's surprising how much that really is present to some degree or another. And I think, oftentimes we just kind of take it as a given, and we don't think about our experience or the other person's experience and how some of those might be different or more intense, or what quality that's there. And I think also that the hormones and these different systems that animate or kind of give a real oomph to a lot of our brain structures and our emotional experiences. It's like if you inject someone with hormones or steroids or other things, it will change their personality. It will change how they feel. And I think sometimes we don't really think about how that is interacting with the stress and burnout, or also, how these micro processes, or even on the peptide level, really start to work. And I think it's fascinating when you think about the same thing, especially when I have couples, when I do work with couples or families. It's interesting how, like in a marriage, for example, what that experience, what one likes or doesn't like, and how they communicate that, and what works and what doesn't work in different types of relationships. And what core relationship aspects and what really is unneeded stress. And sort of going back, I think each of these factors, because I think we need to kind of understand how each of these factors changes, one change in one of these things. Like if we think about like London air quality, if we decrease the air quality enough, will that incrementally start to change, how settled we do feel, or other factors like that? But actually, each of these things kind of link up in a different way. We need to be mindful of it. And I think, with working with addictions, we need to understand what are the things that really kind of trigger off that we need to be attending for, particularly with addiction and addiction behavior, with stress and burnout, and with personality and the psychopathology. So that in some ways we need to start to think in ways that are much more detail-oriented about how do we start to make sense of these things. And it's throughout my career, I've been really shocked at a lot of the addiction treatment I've done, where big things have been overlooked, particularly with social phobias. And I think this is some of the things where what causes someone to drink, or what kind of factors that are there, this can completely change how they feel and their behaviors that are there. And I think, what types of things that they learn when they're younger, and how those kind of factors come out. Just take 2 minutes for the people next to you, and I want you to talk to each other about what is from your understanding, what is the relationship between stress, burnout, and addictions? So just if we can map out, whoever, if you want to get in a group of, 2 or 3 or whatever works, just talk to the closest neighbor to you. And I want you just to kind of talk to each other about, do you think there's a relationship between addictions, stress, and burnout or not? And if you do feel that, what is it? Or if you don't, why not? Okay, I'm going to give you about another minute, so if you switch people if you get a chance to. Okay. Anyone want to feed back what they've been discussing? Okay, go ahead.
So I was just saying to this lovely chap who I was speaking to, I'm recovering from, I've had chronic fatigue syndrome for 20 years, and I'm nearly over that now. And where I see the relationship between stress, burnout, and addictions is to do with the nervous system. Yeah. And the fact that what I learned in my own recovery was that my nervous system was set very high when I was a very small child because of the environment that I was in. Yeah. And so I was basically chasing it my whole life. So my parasympathetic nervous system hadn't really learned the patterns to actually be in what the clinic I'm under calls a calm healing state. Yeah. And I've seen that so much in all my research on addiction as well, is that I've never met an addict that said, I grew up in a really calm environment. We talked about our feelings, if there's anyone in here, I'd love to hear from them, but I've never met anyone in 20 years like that. And so I think for me the link is the nervous system, which you've actually touched on already, but I think that's where the healing lies.
That's beautifully put. I think it's a really important thing, because I think to embody the process and also to contextualize it within the social and the environmental, I think if I can, that's so helpful. Thank you. Anyone else want to feed back? Okay. Well, beautiful. That's beautiful. I think you really said it beautifully. That I think the context to it, there is a relationship, and I think, but it depends on how mindful we are about that. And I guess I want us to start to think about keeping this in mind. What are some of the things, the toolboxes of things, and also how can we really start to think about this rather specifically? Because one of my first slides, that we have a lot of stress, but how we experience those things rather than kind of challenges or things that kind of make us more engaged and more responsible in the world, rather than something where we just switch off and we just feel like game over. Stick a fork in me, I'm done. And I think some of the things, so I want us to think a little bit about the things that can help us. And anyone just want to sort of venture just first thoughts about what they imagine their own perspectives with this. So what things do you think that could help? What toolboxes of things would you want if we were to put things together?
I definitely, because I find myself feeling sort of stressed and burnt out. I think the work that we do, it promotes it, doesn't it? Bless us. And I think that I've really recently been kind of a bit obsessed with, I need to work this, I need to work this, I need to do this, I need to do that, and actually just spending time in nature, for me, it completely turned things around, and in quite an extraordinary fashion. So being in the water, being among the trees, being in green.
Yeah.
My husband laughs at me. He's like, "Oh, here we are, we're in green."
After today, you won't.
It's phenomenally helpful for me.
Yeah. I think that, again, that's beautiful. What other?
For me, I think it's about going back to that pyramid and thinking about the relationship between those three things. So thinking about love, thinking about work, and thinking about play, and trying to regulate myself around those things. You can take a stress in one area, but then you probably need to bolster the other two and just be regulating that.
That's beautiful. Yep, thank you. Do you want to say something? Okay.
Having at least 8 hugs a day to release the oxytocin, spending time with animals, and having lots of fun playing games, being silly, and as well as being in nature. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. And anyone else?
I was thinking about metaphor and the use of metaphor. So if I catch myself getting stressed, I might think about my sailing boat, and I'm not. It's use of metaphor in the moment when there isn't a chance to get out in nature, in the consultant.
Thank you. That's lovely.
I think for me, probably having recovered from burnout, which took a long time. I think connection is really, as well as everything else everyone has said, connection is really key to others.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Isolation fuels it all.
But if we think about what everyone said, it's like there's different types of connection. It's like in some ways getting the right ingredients for all the different things that we need. And I think the nature thing, because part of being in nature is also being in a social environment with other people or animals, and having that kind of experience or connection with that, that's wonderful. But did you want to?
Just using the most powerful word in the English language. No.
Boundaries. Yes, I think that's a good aspect as well. But if you're getting married, that it does create some complexity. Okay, so health, work, love, and play, because I think I think the ecosystem, and I think that we need to start to think about our lives, our inner worlds and our outer worlds, like these really tremendously deep ecosystems. And if we start to disrupt one aspect, what's going to happen, and how do we start to get these things in the right direction, the right way? And in kind of assessing different areas of one's life. And this is where just kind of take a mental note. I mean, if we think of health, work, love, and play, and kind of just take a minute and jot down or take a mental note, where do you think you are in each of these areas? If you think of 0 to 100%, 0 is sort of super game over, 100% is like, that is, the best state you could ever imagine being in. Where do you feel, for these 4 key areas, where do you feel you are? Really honestly.
Could you just say the scale again?
Sure, 0 to 100%. So if you think about...
0's low?
0 is like, not good. Not good. 100%, if you think about like the test score, You know, it's almost like if you think of the exam test score, not that, you know, it's a little like the educational system, not that I'm teaching to test here. Go ahead.
Could you just clarify the 4 areas again?
Sure.
Health,
So health, work, love, and play.
Play.
Yeah. In some ways, it's kind of a modified experience of what Freud said. I worked with Mark Soames on the Standard Edition, so I read through the 24 volumes times 2. So it's sort of, if I was to get a tattoo, it would probably, you know, it would be something to that effect, because it's like, you know, it's a sort of kept this theme that he was talking about at a very deep, thoughtful level. You know, how do we really start to make sense of who we are in a dynamic way? But I think, especially with the body, you know, some of the advents of the psychological expertise that a lot of the traumatologists have developed at a really amazing level. If you think of Bessel van der Kolk, you know, there's some really great, amazing thinkers. How do we put this through our body, and how do we start to make sense of these things that really tremendously change how we feel about ourselves in the world? And they have impacts that I think most of the time we just don't really give enough pause for thought for. And even the notion of like kind of what poverty is, if we think about, you know, the degree of health or mental attitude or negativity, you know, all of these aspects that, you know, what is the real quality of our life? And do we give enough thought and care and respect to actually really, both for ourselves and the people that we work with? I mean, there's certain ways that sometimes we don't really live as fully as we need to, and that's a shame. You know, we're only, the ground time will be short. You know, why don't we make a better, more complete use of our lives? And this is one very key way. It's a little like airplane maintenance. You know, if the landing gear is not going down, you know, we're going to have problems. And there's certain ways that we know if one of these areas is kind of problematic, we do need to attend to this in some way or another. And I think this changes our bandwidth, it changes our decision making, it changes who we are, the depth of who we are, it changes our emotional intelligence, our problem solving. And I think there's a lot of ways that, you know, if we think about our irritation or frustration, and how do we kind of keep that in balance where we're not being overly sarcastic or kind of irritated or kind of miserable. You know, these are really important things. And I think, you know, really getting to kind of some of the core mechanisms, because I think one of the things that we don't think about enough in terms of addictionology or even in terms of the psychotherapy or psychological expertise in terms of the processes, a lot of addiction happens because the drip, 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 and then something gets triggered. And if we think about triggers and ruptures, and also addictions is a kind of core part of that, there are certain ways that we need to really understand, I think, both for the people that we're working with as well as ourselves. There are certain things that we just set us off, and I think most of the time we don't even know what those are. And I want, let me just go through this a little bit here, because reasons what is called wrongly the Swiss cheese model. It's actually Gruyere cheese if you're going to use your food groups properly here. That if we think about when something happens, it's like, you know, how does someone develop an alcohol or drinking or another addiction? That it's a little bit like the military security with Snowden. You know, something happened, something went through, the NSA security issues didn't stop that one, and it didn't stop this one, and bam, WikiLeaks. and if we think about the same thing happens with an addiction, that these factors that are there, some of the things with really healthy systems and things in place, it's like, you know, being able to go for a walk in nature or getting that extra hug. I think it really can mediate some of the things where it just contains one and it kind of helps put everything to rights and makes it easier and better. And I think really understanding how the triggers, risks, and ruptures are, this very much is, this is all part of risk, and it's all part of the pathway developments with that. And if you think about stages of addiction, there's pathways, and there's very robust kind of developmental models of it starts, this like gateway drugs and kind of levels of processing, but it escalates a lot like a gambling addict. What's the difference between putting a bet down at the blackjack table versus losing your house? There's processes there that some of it is physiological, some of it is about negativity and kind of risk analysis and also enactment of that. And there's physiological aspects, if we think of like the response and what it feels like. It's like if you talk to a shopping addict, it feels really good to buy something, but just like the gambling addict, both of them feel awful afterwards. Or if you think of the alcoholic who, and there's all different types, but more or less it leaves one feeling worse. But that's not the physiology of going into it. And I think, understanding the ruptures, triggers, and addictions, and especially the negative emotions, because a lot of it, most of these are there not because in the long run they make someone feel good. In the long run, it makes them feel terrible. And I think in some ways it reenacts and revivifies a lot of those things where it just does something that a lot like what was said before in terms of the early experience, it revivifies a lot of those distressing early experiences. And I think one of the things that, just like with Syria, that we have to think about complex systems and addiction, and I think, what was said before, that, it's very few family systems that run beautifully where the person, there are some counterpoints to that possibly, but at least in my experience and probably similarly with yours, you're looking at more of a complex system that doesn't work, that it's it has instability, unintended consequences, vicious error loops, problems of scale, and it really, it fundamentally degrades human life and well-being and welfare. And some of the things that are there is how do we get all those things so that we understand where we can, just like the honor code, how do we stop something, the slippery slope of having something devolve into something really terrible? And how do we contain, a lot like what was saying about like saying no. This is one where it's about that containment, and it's about addressing it with care and with compassion. And I think addictions, like most ruptures, it just blows everything up. It causes havoc. And I think some of it is understanding and having a sensitivity to understand why and how they're using it. And I've written a new addictions test, which hopefully I'm updating the software platform to be able to get it to work with a much more complex addiction psychometric testing scale. And I think it's the first one of its kind that really starts to look at very, very highly dynamic factors and really coming out with a very clear and clean clinical formulation so that we can actually start to separate out, like an MRI scan, what are the issues and actually how do we make sense of what they are? Because there's a lot of blurriness, if you think of stages of change, there's all these questions about what's going to work and where the person really is, that sometimes it's in the muddle we get lost and we're not able to clearly define how it works or what's going to work best for the person. And I think this is one of the things that's kind of taking a sort of brief overview, defining and really understanding there's these key things that almost like mantras we have to come back to, understanding where the person is and their the enlightenment and also where they want to change and what they're ready for, and also really being able to help with these deeper levels of things where it's about meaning fundamentally. Even the addiction, that there is something that we need to get to grips with. It has some meaning, like a dream, that we need to be able to parse apart and to help them understand. And I think sort of the practicalities of the triggers, there's these things that, just like learning styles, a little bit like sort of the cognitive processes like Pavlov's dog, what are the things of how we learn to do those things? You know, we go to school and learn things, or we grow up in a house with a drug addict or an alcoholic, or our patients do, and, you know, we learn certain things, and whether we're aware of them or not, you know, I think this is one of the things that, like having that sort of big view with Da Vinci's sort of skyward view of Imola, part of a really good addictions treatment is changing that person's perspective so they see something that they've never seen before. Like, for example, what is a healthy family system? What are good boundaries? What's love like? You know, what does it feel to be really cared for in a way where they're not going to be abused or hurt or taken advantage of? And I think, you know, we need to, both as clinicians and also as a cross dialogue, we need to see what's out there and what works, and also know that the same thing won't work for everybody. And how do we talk about some of those things? You know, individual differences. You know, it's like with children, you know, I've got 2 sons, their personalities are completely different. You know, it's like if you think about all your different patients and even oneself, you know, each person's a unique universe, and how do you get the right kind of thing that will kind of match that and work for that person? So I want to bring it back to some of the practical things that, just like the triggers and what I've described as psychological body armor. I was in Germany over the weekend working with the military and the veteran service, and it, you know, particularly when you're dealing with people that are dealing with stuff that can really affect them in all sorts of ways if they don't have a flak jacket. But emotions are just as damaging as a 50 caliber bullet. Maybe sometimes even more, depending on who's shooting it and where it's hit, and also what kind of body armor or what kind of defensive structures you have in place, countermeasures for that. And I think one of the other things as well, that we need to start to think about different levels. Like there's one thing is, you know, the body armor, and there's another thing about like the psychological vaccinations. What are the things that we need to build up our immunity and the kind of health of those systems? And also to build up our kind of self-consciousness and our mental and emotional and moral kind of well-being. So I think if we think about the body armor and the life triggers, we need to understand that the person is not as prone to manipulation or is not as reactive. And fundamentally, it's about both vulnerability and improving resiliency. And I think these are things that getting really good with these factors, they can change our health in ways that we don't really understand, like the incremental health things. It's like, you know, having better diets, you know, not dieting, but having better nutrition and better portion size. You know, what are the things that are there? So I want you to think about what's your own psychological body armor and your own vaccinations. So I want you, if we think about, and I'll take a vote on it. Would you rather talk in your own groups, or would you rather have me speak with someone and I could go through kind of some more detailed questions? What would you prefer? Demonstration. Demonstration? Is everyone? Okay. Okay, so let's, do I have anyone that is has the courage and the kindness? Okay. Okay. Yes, please, yeah. Yep. And can we sit, or do we have to stand? Stand. Okay. Okay. Stand. Okay. Come over. Yeah. Okay. So I think. Thank you. I'm just going to go through a couple of the questions, because one of the things that I've written in my psychometric testing hat. So I've developed a system. If we think of the really detailed version of this, because I think in a lot of ways, almost sort of military testing standard, because there's a lot of questions that if we really open up the detail of some of these things, both the clinical and expertise, to get people to really understand what are those triggers in more detailed levels. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but just a couple of kind of things to orient us a little bit, and just share what you feel is what you feel comfortable with. Does that sound fair? Okay. So, do you think is there any trigger that you particularly feel is a kind of issue for you in terms of your emotional response or things that kind of consistently comes up when you kind of think about it?
I've probably got vulnerability around my son.
Okay.
So worry, anxiety around my son.
Okay.
That may be that particular trigger.
Can you say what aspect of it? I mean, if we think about.
If I'm honest, it's probably a combination. I worry about him, that he's going to be okay, that he's going to have enough, that he's going to all of those kind of normal things. And I also worry about my worry.
Okay.
Because I think I'm over-involved, I'm enmeshed, I'm being really
helicopter mom.
So I kind of go in and out of that.
Okay. And do you think this affects both the quality of your life or your kind of thinking space?
Yeah.
Okay. And like what percentage would you give it? From 0 to 100%, like if we think of it, how much does it affect your thinking space? 100% is completely, 0 is not at all.
Okay. So if I think about a recent time, I would probably say. Okay, I'm going to put a bit of an addendum, because if I'm working, I'm not doing that. It's gravity.
But do you think that you may do that same worry with your patients?
No.
No. Okay, just checking. Just checking.
Is that true? Have I just told a lie?
I'm good with lies. Finding them out.
To be honest with you, I am not as vulnerable around that stuff. I feel much more able to hold that my patient's anxiety than I am. I mean, it's palpable. I am a mess around my son.
Okay.
I'm kind of alright with my patients.
Okay, but around your son, if we think about as a vulnerability, it really that's noticeable.
Yeah.
It feels like there's a big kind of hole inside relative. It's as a rupture or something that sort of disorganizes you.
It's a huge trigger for me.
Okay.
It's a disproportionate trigger for me.
Okay.
So if I think in terms of if something's a recent thing, like I'm worried about his business, he's having a bit of a hard time. It probably was probably taking about I'd say about 75% of my non-working time. Do you know? And so I would, if I was going to and from, that's a lot.
Yeah.
A lot.
I mean, so resolving this would be a big improvement. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I want to sort of go layer by layer, because thank you so much for telling us about this. This is really important. So if we think about, does it affect how you communicate with them, do you think?
Definitely.
Okay. In what way?
I'm not relaxed.
Okay.
I'm very over-analytical about what I'm saying. Am I saying the right thing? Am I being over-involved? Am I being under-involved? I'm absolutely like washing machine head about it. So I definitely don't communicate relaxed.
And do you think he understands and responds to that sort of discombobulated version of the communication in a way where he gets kind of disoriented a little bit?
Yeah, he finds it frustrating.
Okay. And do you think, in terms of what would his vulnerability be, or if we think of like his trigger, is he triggered by your response to him? Like, in other words, because like if we think about what the corresponding factors are, and this is something that's really important, if we have a trigger, it's a little bit like Velcro. You know, what's the other person's factor as well that actually links up with that?
So this is probably massively overexposing.
You're with people that love you.
Okay, so I can remember a specific situation where I'm saying, we're talking, we're being relatively sensible, we've got some good information, we're getting, and then I say to him, darling, I think it would be a really good idea for you to go to BDA. I really think that's the solution, get into some recovery around your business. And he almost started having a panic attack. So I almost started having a panic, and I was looking at him and thinking, I don't know what's triggered this.
Yeah.
But something in that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I suspect it was just I've got so much to do. Please don't ask me to do anything else. But it was definitely, it was like a ping pong ball.
Yeah.
Like until the two of us were more like that. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect, because the affectivity, because if we think about two complete energetic bodies and systems, if one person's triggered, it's oftentimes the other person will be too. It's like if you're walking along and somebody trips, you're a lot more likely to kind of have that physical rupture in a way, and your body kind of, because that emotional synchronization to whatever degree, there is something that happens at a very deep energetic and physical level. And I think this is some of the thing where that understanding how this is a little bit like a kind of explosion, how does that disrupt whatever the systems that are in place and really brings everything to a halt in some way or another. And if we think of an addiction as one way to cope with when that rupture happens in a way. And I think, so what theme would you describe, if we think about, how would you describe this as a theme, this rupture as a theme? Like, what other words would you describe it as, a sort of pattern or a kind of theme in your life?
A theme in my life?
Yeah.
Around him or around?
Just in general, whatever comes to mind, whatever the associations are.
Over responsibility.
Okay. And if we think of what happens if you don't have the over responsibility?
I think straight.
Okay, but when you're in that triggered mode, my sense is that it's there for a particular reason. Your thought, if you don't have that level.
Okay. So what am I afraid will happen if I don't? Oh,
because there's a catastrophize. Because if we think of this is one of the things that's really interesting. That there's a real worry, because if we think of someone, it's like, God forbid if something happens on the underground or something, that's a trigger that everybody thinks, oh no, avoid that.
Okay. No, I know what you mean.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, he's fine. He's kind of alright. He keeps telling me, he really does. He tells me that not to worry, that I'm being mental. But this is what. So for the purposes of, what we're talking about, what my fantasy is if I don't make him do whatever it is, or if I don't protect him, if I don't give him money, if I don't bail him out, whatever it is, I am convinced that he is going to fail, that he's going to be homeless, that he is going to that he's going to end up where I ended up.
Okay, which is what?
So in addiction.
Okay.
And I know.
Did you feel that?
Yeah. I know that is an overblown response. I know it is, but that's definitely what fuels my response. Is that I'm afraid that he's not going to be okay.
Oh, okay, but if you think about your experience of addiction, because a lot of ways where you are today, which is also a loving and fabulous human being, which amazing heart and amazing compassionate soul, this was the making of you.
Yeah.
But yet you're afraid that he's going to get to grips with whatever factors that you had to go through.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think that one of my biggest life lessons is to allow him to. It is two actually. One is to allow him to have his own experience, because he has his own higher power and I am not it. And
even if you did bring him into the world.
even if you bring him into the world, I think he chose me. So that's the truth. I need to allow him to have his own experience. And the other thing that I forget is that I'm over-identified with him. He is not me, and he has stood with his hands on my shoulders saying, "I am not you." He's much more resilient. He's much more robust, and he has something that I didn't have. He has a lot of stuff that I didn't have. So he's a different person with different responses. So actually, I think he can manage his problems, and I think he can manage them better than I did, even although my experiences were valuable. So.
Can you feel the difference if I kind of focus kind of in your solar plexus? It's like being able to let go of something. Because if we think about, because the trigger that's there, disorganized 75% of your emotional life. That's a lot. And if we think about, what do you think it will be like letting go of that 75% unnecessary control? What do you think is going to happen?
I think I will. Ironically, I think I will be able to. Well, I'll be able to relax a bit. I'll be able to feel more peaceful. But I actually also think I will be able to bring more sense into helping him.
Because if you're not affectively triggering him, because if you're triggered, you're going to trigger him. That's for sure. And the difference between if you come and you're so emotionally grounded, which you're so capable of doing, I mean, at an amazing level, if you bring that in, he's not going to respond in a way where he's going to rupture and kind of respond negatively. He's going to think, what a great idea. Can you see the difference with that?
Yeah, really.
Can you? Does everyone else see that? And I think, how are you feeling now?
I feel better. I feel like that is true.
And if we think about that kind of energetic peacefulness and kind of reconsolidation, because I can feel it's just like, letting go the sort of ball of stress. And also this is the difference between owning and kind of compartmentalizing something where all of your energy is kind of locked up in a way that just causes you stress and literal. Did you have any physical symptoms when you worry about him and things? Okay. But this is the difference of also correcting some of those factors as well. Because I think, do you have any questions for what we're talking about? I mean, does it make sense of what we're talking about?
It makes absolute sense.
Yeah. Do other people, can you see, I mean, this is the really brief version of trying to sort of fast track through a whole number of different levels or aspects of it. But it's also, if you think of, the privilege of being able to talk to you about this and make sense of it. Because I think this is one of the things, if we think about like the flak jacket in a way, and also feeling at peace, that you don't feel under siege at all. Does that make sense? But it's also having something where you don't feel vulnerable, you feel resilient. And really knowing what that's like emotionally and communicating that to the people that you care most about, and also everybody else. Because if other people, whether we're aware of it or not, people can just feel that the stress or the tension with that. Especially, I think, in some ways in the therapeutic world, that we're more attuned to those things than other people. And I think we do kind of sense that. And those are things, the difference between really feeling super much at peace. Does anyone have any questions, either for me or Adele, about some? And keep in mind, this is sort of the fast-tracked version, where there's a whole, there's a lot of different things we can look at. But I just wanted to kind of sort of outline some of the brief, live. And thank you so much for being able to share that. It's just incredible. Thank you. Can you give me a hand? So I think the more that we can start to bring the detail and the understanding of how what are the things that, why we react, and what are the things that actually really change our kind of mental space or mental state. This is one of the biggest ones, and I think it's oftentimes we don't really talk about it or think about it. And I think also we need to kind of think through, what are the changes that would make the biggest difference to our life or our patients' lives or the people that we work with. We don't really think about those. I mean, sometimes it's like if we could, wave a magic wand and just get one big thing so it just changes that experience for ourselves or for that other person. Sometimes, if you think of, what we're talking about with the 75%, that's a big ticket item in terms of psychic change. And getting that so that's, zeroed down, so that's not a kind of the trigger or the Velcro that just kind of organizes our emotional life. And I think, a lot of this sort of coming back, I think there's an inner and an outer understanding of these factors that I think that we're trying to get to a kind of mechanism and a kind of view of these different things that really, we can drill down and you can get to sort of much more precise aspects of it. And so hopefully in 6 months or 8 months, if you want to check my website for Psychological Systems Limited, this test will be up there, and I think, and also hopefully the addictions test will be there too, one for general drug and alcohol as well as for food, because I think there's a lot of things, our relationship with those things really does sort of make a big difference and be able to assess it properly. With the time, I'm just going to kind of zip through. I want to tell you just briefly one of the things that really changed my view and how the environmental factors feed into this. I went with one of my best friends who's he's changed his job recently, but he was one of the head medical doctors for the British Special Forces. And we were looking at gender-based violence and genocide in different parts of Africa, particularly the DRC. And one of the things that really shocked me, because through most of the country in the kind of healthy parts, there's this incredible lush jungle. But where the militia was, it was just devastated. And I think that was one of the things that when I really got to grips, and it took me several months to kind of process, it's almost like there's not a damn tree in the place, and it was just like devastated. And we went to the different hospitals, and my friends and colleagues there, some of them personally, one of my friends, I think 5 members of his family out of 7 were brutally murdered, probably by his neighbors. And they went in and they just took everything and they killed everyone. And some of the brutalness, and I went to the Genocide Museum there, which is really very, very moving, and they have the remains of a good percentage of the population that were victims of the mass killing. And the rates were 800,000 people within, I think, 5 months or 4.5 months, which was, in terms of the acceleration and the mass killing, maybe not in terms of total numbers of the Holocaust, but in terms of the amount of people that were killed in a short amount of time, it was incredibly shocking. And we went to the hospitals in different parts of the DRC, and this was the women's hospital and also the outpatients place. And some of the issues in and around, there was one incredibly brave woman that was, her husband, it was horrible, but literally was killed, and just really, really horrible stuff happened where it was just unbelievable. And I spent the day in Rwanda with Irvin Staub's team, who is using media to send a message of peace and to get people to work together and to stop hate crime, which was a really interesting thing of, as opposed to sort of kind of nasty media or kind of negative things. How do we get people to really work together? I was really moved by that. But a lot of it in terms of growing and going back to the nature, because I think this is one of the biggest things. I really don't think that we at all understand how important being in the natural world is, and the difference between growing different plants, watching them grow, the micronutrition, the vegetation, all of the things that are there, and it does something. Keep in mind that growing plants are 300, I think there's also flowering plants are 350 million years old. So we're relatively about 2 million as a species. Homo sapien is 2 million to 350 million. If you were to think about your iPhone, if Apple had 350 million years to get the product right, there are things there that we just have not explored or understood at all. I mean, if you put a piece of fruit next to each other, they communicate with pheromones and other things with ripening, and it's completely, there's no cell phone that can do that yet. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. And there's aspects that how we're connected to the environment and the things that we need with that. And some of the things I was looking at is how can we start to build and experience, both with movement and kind of an awareness of our environment and our bodies and our experience of ourselves, and being able to nurture and grow that in all sorts of different ways. And I think this is one of the things. I'm not going to go. I'm going to sort of skip through this because I want to have a little bit of time for questions. But I think one of the other things too. My wonderful friend and colleague Jaak Penkstad recently died. I think it's like 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He developed the field of affective neuroscience, and he was literally was the Darwin of the 21st century. He was amazing. He also discovered rat laughter. But he looked at the neuropsychological underpinnings of emotion in a way that I think it will take us another 100 years or even more to actually get to grips with how profound some of his thinking was with that. And he was a sweet human being as well. But I think some of the things I'm describing that we need to understand, our inner world and our outer world, the universe. These are things that it's surprising how close they are. I mean, how these things work, even to the degree of, if we think of quantum mechanics, its intentional fields completely alters the physics of that. And if you think about how mind-blowing that is. And if we think of, that our brains are wired in all sorts of ways, if we think about what we eat and the micronutrition, the social communication and the frontal lobes, and also the sense of who we are, Bud Craig developed the notion of the insular cortex, and actually assembling time and space in a way almost like physics. It's like he called it the global emotional moment, that we assemble all the feedback with our body, our social environments, and put it together to actually help us understand who we are. How mind-blowing is that? And I think some of the things like with EMDR in the connectomics and the tract factors with that, the white matter tracks, they're incredibly, I mean, look at this. This is just a kind of rough kind of way that if we think of the way EMDR, these other kind of energy psychology and psychotherapy interventions, they do some really mind-blowing things. And even the way that that we're built for conflict, and we're also built for kind of conflict resolution. And I think the way that this is Jaak's kind of core psychological sort of affective neurocircuits, and they go up to much more complicated things, and how we mediate that. And I think most of it comes down to hate versus love. It's like negative affective emotions or positive ones. And we really need to kind of get to grips with understanding this affects, how we experience ourselves and other people in the world, and our problem solving, and also whether we feel burnt out or not. And even if we think about the issues with Brexit or Trump, our leadership and these aspects of do we have leaders that reflect the ecological responsibility and the care that's there, or do we have people that fundamentally that just go in and just take as much as they can and not think about the sort of shared collective aspects and the responsibility of that? Because what I've been working on recently, and what I spoke about with the Syria conference, is that if you impinge the amount that's there, the people with power will take more and more and try to sort of take it away faster and burn through it more. And so what, just kind of linking together the key thought for why I described it as burn through, because the models that we have for burnout, they're actually kind of static models compared to something that's much more dynamic and potentially much more disturbing, that really does include an environmental base to it, and we need to be aware of that. These things really do affect every aspect of who we are, our leadership, our community, the care, and who we are as human beings, and also whether we respect, as my friend, shaman friend Kira Kindi would say, sort of our relationship with Pachamama, the Earth Mother. These things do make a big difference of whether we have a good relationship with those things or not. So just in conclusion, that we need to understand our own history, our own stress levels, our trauma attachment patterns, and also what we can do to really improve those and really catch, and really kind of mark out our own levels of health, work, love, and play, and for the people that we work with, and ask people about this. When you go home, give your spouse and or children or anybody that's important, or your friend, a hug, and just kind of check in with yourself and check in with them, and kind of have a conversation about these things, and kind of check, and kind of sort of like checking the oil or something, what's going on with that, and understanding that addictions are one ways that we, if there's problems with any of those things, this may be a kind of indicator or kind of temperature gauge for issues with these things. And I think, what can we do to kind of de-trigger or kind of get those things at a healthier level, and really contribute to healing things at profound levels. Because I think if we think about, we're put on this earth to do some amazing things, we need to be able to work at that level. We need to be able to think about what's the absolute healthiest version of us that we can be, and how can we help other people experience that in ways that, almost just like Da Vinci's aerial perspective, we need to think in ways that we've never thought about before, and talk to each other about it, and to be able to think in ways that push ourselves and each other to do things in a way that is absolutely, completely innovative and world-changing. Thank you very much. Any questions? Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, thank you.
Pleasure.
Just given the amount that you do, I wondered about your own balance and how you manage that to keep well.
I think some of it, I do have downtime. This week, I think some of it is I love what I do, which helps a lot. I mean, you can see that for me, this is the best job in the universe, so that helps a lot. Considering this, over the long weekend, I was doing a specialist clinic in Germany, and this week has been pretty much, and I'm going back, but every week isn't like that. So I do have downtime, and I do take pretty good care of myself, and it helps that, at least thus far, I think I like a higher tempo. If I got bored, I think that's more worrying for me than if I have too much downtime or something. So yeah, I think it's trying to get the right balance of it. And it's also knowing yourself well enough to know what you want to do and what's good, and not overdoing it as well. I think when I was standing in line on Monday evening trying to wait for people to go out from the airplane. There's different triggers for every different one, you know. I think as long as I have an open pathway and I don't get blocked in, I get good, you know, that's fine. It's when I get stuck, that's when I get frustrated. But yes, thank you. Are there other questions? I'm going to ask, go ahead.
It was very useful to have you doing these sort of questions, and I wondered when you are going to publish that as a protocol or where we can access it.
I think for the test, I've written the test already, but I'm going to put it as a psychometric test. I've got a great team that's helping me. They're moving slower than I'd like them to do. Surprise, surprise. Yeah. But we're reworking the platform for this so that hopefully there will be a whole number of different tests, including tests for surgery, relationship tests across the lifespan as well, which I think will be really exciting. There's all sorts of different things that, you know, those of you who know me, I have a really eclectic, I think, you know, going back to the first question as well, I am able to mix and match different things, so it's like I'm never a dull moment. Which is, you know, for me it's good. But I think some of it too is sometimes it takes a long time to get things done, and you have to be patient and you know, it's the finishing, completing things. Sometimes it takes, like the psychometric testing, this has been over 10 or 11 years since I first started this to getting the levels of things that I've been working on now. So, I mean, yeah, it takes a while. Other questions? I want each of you to think about, like, if you think of your own homework, because my hope is that you really, this has sparked some really kind of deep internal thinking spaces where you really improve your self-care and your well-being, and also you ask about other people that are close and important to you, and trying to sort of get that dialogue in the best way possible. Because it's amazing when you feel real compassion and love. It just makes your life so much better. And the more we can experience that and share that, I think, you know, it's almost, it really transforms what it means to feel and to be in the world. And it's sometimes really amazing levels. And the more that we can do that and share that and experience that and do that for each other, I think that the quality of relationship is so much better. I just want to thank you as well for kind of hanging in there. I know this has been a kind of marathon session. When Sam told me I had an hour and a half, I thought, oh goody, and then I thought, those poor people. So I think, you know, hopefully, because, you know, I've squashed in, you know, one of my friends was in the Special Forces was saying to his friend, he said, talking to Richard's great, but it makes your head hurt for about 2 weeks after. He said, you get better with it. He said, you know, you get so much faster and it really improves things, but that 2-week time lag, that it's a challenge, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, go ahead.
One last question. Are you an optimist? That sounds a ridiculous question. Are you, especially at times?
I think so. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, some of it, I also, my goal is to have the resiliency of a high-rad cockroach as well. You know, I think some of it is, just because things are difficult, you don't need to, there's ways to manage things. You know, some of it might be unpleasant, but, you know, there's a whole number of different things you can do, even in the worst case scenario, which I think sometimes people don't realize. And I think some of it is trying to keep yourself as safe as possible, as best you can, not in a way that you hold yourself back, but I think it's also of knowing how to deal with stuff that is really, really difficult. And I guess that's what I would say my sort of philosophy would be. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.